Hello, David Harper of Bionic Turtle with a brief illustration of the asset-backed commercial paper conduit. First, about the motivation. If we think about a company that manufactures a product and then ships that product to its customer, along with the product, it will typically ship an invoice, such that the customer doesn't typically return cash to the company immediately, but rather waits a few days. It's as if the customer has a charge card. That invoice represents the receivable, the trade receivable that is carried on the company's balance sheet as an asset, minus some allowance for the doubtful accounts. All other things being equal, the company would probably prefer to convert the asset, the trade receivable, into cash as quickly as possible. And broadly, there are three ways to do this. First, by discounting the invoice. The invoice may contain favorable terms that motivate the customer to pay cash almost immediately. Secondly, the company can factor, which is to sell these receivables, these assets, to a third party in exchange for cash immediately. And third, the company can engage an asset-backed commercial paper conduit. And so that's what we'll look at. Just keep in mind, it's a vehicle, a way to convert a trade receivable, which is the promise of the receipt of cash from the customer, hopefully very soon. It's a way to convert that asset into cash more quickly. We can start with the bank or the sponsor, which typically has a relationship with several companies. Each of those companies has trade receivables. And then there's a creation of the asset-backed commercial paper conduit. This is the special purpose entity which is created. And that conduit purchases the receivables from the companies in exchange for an interest in those receivables, the conveyance of the principal and interest. So notice at this moment, the companies who have these short-term assets, these trade receivables, have monetized them because the conduit has purchased them. Where did the conduit get the cash to purchase the receivables? It gets the cash from the investors. The conduit issues commercial paper to the investors in exchange for their cash. That's the cash that's used to purchase the receivables. So the receivables are generating the cash flow into the conduit. The conduit is returning this cash flow to the investors who hold this commercial paper notes. Traditionally, the bank or sponsor tries to retain an equity or residual tranche. We saw this before in the CDO structures. So let me make two final points about this. In regard to the cash flow, if we think about the receivable cash flow that's being generated, it typically does not have a maturity. Companies expect to be paid, say, in 30 days, but oftentimes those obligations go longer. Oftentimes it does not bear any interest, as opposed to the notes, the commercial paper sold to the investors. Those typically have floating rates, they do bear interest, and they have short-term maturity. So there is a dramatic mismatch in regard to the cash flows, which makes the support mechanism to the conduit very important. So support in two forms: credit support and liquidity support. This credit and liquidity support is helping the conduit manage the cash flow mismatch between these receivables, which are somewhat erratic, non-interest bearing, and this commercial paper notes, which tend to be floating rate with short-term maturity. Traditionally, the bank tried to provide both roles under FIN 46. The bank has grave difficulty providing both credit and liquidity support. And the second point I'd make about this is that it's not a one-time event. It is what's called a continuous conveyance. The conduit is continuously purchasing an interest in these receivables and funding this with a continuous rollover, so to speak, of commercial paper to the investors. So you can think about this in dynamic terms. So this is David Harper, the Bionic Turtle. Thanks for your time.